Welcome to On the Same Page. I'm Tommy Sanders. Today our guest is the author Francine Prose, who's the author of 15 works of fiction, but we'll take a different turn today and examine her two latest works of nonfiction. The first one, Reading Like a Writer, in which she instructs us to read more closely, to examine more carefully the works of the greatest writers of all time in order to make ourselves better writers and more satisfied readers. We'll also take a look at this book, Anne Frank, The Book, The Life and the Afterlife, a wealth of new information and perspective on one of the most enduring pieces of writing of the 20th century. Today, On the Same Page. Well, now Francine Prose joins us. Welcome to Arkansas, and I should give you this information that her appearance here is courtesy of the Hendrix-Murphy Foundaiton Programs in Literature and Language. This year the theme is Word and Image, so we are very thankful to the Hendrix-Murphy Foundation for making this possible. Thanks for being with us today, and as promised, we're going to start with your other two nonfiction books today, but the one that came out in 2006, I believe it was. Reading Like a Writer. And it says on the cover here, a guide for people who love books and for those who want to write them. Who is it written more for? Was it instruction for writers, or was it help for all of us readers here?
Well, it started out as instruction for writers. At the very beginning, I mean, the way the book started was that I would go to, I'd had the experience of going to writing programs, undergraduate, graduate writing programs, and at the end of the hour there'd be a Q&A, and students, and often graduate writing students, would say to me, so what are you reading? And I would say, oh, Crime and Punishment or something, you know. I mean, and then there'd be this terrible silence, and it would be clear to me that these writing students had never read anything, as far as I could tell. So, and I thought, well, how are they possibly learning to write, or why are they learning to write if they're not readers? Because that was how I learned to write. I mean, I don't have a graduate degree in writing. I've always felt like kind of that I sort of got in by mistake. But I learned to write by reading, and I still learn to write by reading. So I thought, okay, I'm going to write for these students, and say, okay, this is how you do it. If you want to write a certain kind of scene, you think about a writer who, a great writer who wrote that scene beautifully, and look at how a writer does it, and then use whatever you can learn in your own work, which is how, as I said, I learned and continue to learn. So that was really how the book started. But then after I wrote it, I realized that I was writing for readers as well, because readers often ask, how do writers read? Is that different from the way in which a normal writer reads? And it seemed to me that the way writers read could be useful for just readers and people who love books to read. So that's partly what the book is about too, how we read and how you could read.
With the first part of your story in mind, if people take writing courses or workshops or graduate programs not because they read, why do they go? Why do they enroll in them? What's
I don't know. It's still a mystery to me. I mean, I think there's still some idea that writing is glamorous, and that there's that somehow there's
it's like going to school to be a rock star.
Exactly,
like
exactly. Yeah. But in fact, it's not like that at all. It's very hard.
You can.
Well, yeah, it's very hard work, and you have to have patience for long hours by yourself in front of your computer.
Yeah. First part of the book, first chapter of the book, very quickly brings up the subject of can writing, creative writing, be taught, and the usefulness or not usefulness of workshops and graduate programs in creative writing and things like that. What are the conclusions that are coming? Your conclusions?
Well, there's certain things that can be taught. You can teach students to edit themselves. I mean, line editing is a very useful skill. What you can cut, what you can do without, what's missing, what needs to be added, all that sort of word by word, line by line. When I first started teaching, this was a gazillion years ago, I thought anyone can learn to write. There's really no such thing really as talent. You can write and learn by writing. I no longer think that. I think there's certain gifts for language, gifts for telling stories that people have, but there's certain things again that they can learn, and that is how to use language really. But to be able to tell a story, I think you have to have a kind of ability for it really.
Mm-hmm. But reading more closely, is another way you can enhance whatever natural gift you have.
Well,
right?
exactly.
That's the
exactly.
thesis
I
of the
mean,
book.
for, you know, and in a very kind of you know, subject by subject way. I mean, the book is divided into gesture, dialogue, narration, and so forth. So there are all these things. I mean, you're trying to write dialogue, seemingly easy, but actually quite difficult. And then you go and, you know, one thing to do is say, okay, which writers write great dialogue, and how can I take a book apart, you know, or a section apart and learn from that. So, I mean, the whole point of the book really is slow down, read word by word, line by line, look at what a writer is doing in the way that, you know, an auto mechanic might look at how an engine is put together, or, you know, I've seen surgeons admire each other's appendectomy scars, or, you know, whatever that,
Sure.
I mean, in that kind of technical way that we do, and it's useful on every level, again, for writers and readers.
So just the raw mechanics of it is helpful
Yeah.
to examine more. Well, how do most of us consumers read? I mean, obviously we don't read that way, and what are we missing when we talk about the other purpose, the books to help our readers?
Well, we read different books different ways. I mean, let me say, you know, people are often saying to me, don't tell me you read everything this way, that slowly, word by word, line by line. And it's true, I don't. I mean, if I'm on an airplane and I'm reading a popular mystery, I'm not going to stop, you know, I'm just reading not to be where I am, which is quite different from reading War and Peace.
You had a great story about the time you used to spend in bus stations commuting to work, and you would only read People magazine there because you were afraid you'd lose track of the world if you got into your literature.
That's right.
Yeah.
But then when I'm reading, you know, the title of the book grammatically should be Reading as a Writer, but it didn't sound quite as good. So when I'm reading as a writer, I'm really reading in that slow way. How does Chekhov do something? How does Tolstoy do something? How does Flannery O'Connor do something? And trying to learn in that way, you know, that I can use in my own process as a writer. When I teach, that's the way I teach. I mean, in class, I teach at Bard College now in the Hudson Valley, and in class, I sit there with the students and we go over a short story, let's say a John Cheever short story or a Mavis Gallant story, word by word, line by line. And we say, why this word, why not another word? What does this adjective tell us? How is the writer communicating information in a certain way? And all that is extremely useful, again, as readers and as writers.
Yeah. Before we get off the subject of the other way it's done, the creative writing workshops and stuff like that, everything you teach nowadays is strictly literature based. Is that correct?
No, you know, the class that I have been teaching, which I really enjoy, is it's a literature reading class. In class, we do that reading of short stories, and then outside of class, I ask my students to take a newspaper story that interests them, any kind of story in the news, and to read it in 3 different newspapers, and compare the way in which language is used to spin a story in 3 different newspapers. So, and it's often kind of illuminating for them because we're all trained to think we read it in the newspaper, it's true, and so forth and so on. But when they read that way, they suddenly realize that a word choice or a detail that's left in or left out can really tell kind of a different story. So I feel that in the class, I'm not only helping to educate readers of literature, but participants in a democracy.
Do you think that most great writers, including the ones that you recommend and the ones you cite in your book, are people who examine literature the way you do, that closely, that closer reading?
All the writers I know do.
All the writers you know?
I mean, yeah. I mean, and in fact, it's
or
you
know
know,
of, yeah.
Well, it's wonderful to read writers on other writers. I mean, all the way down from Henry James to John Berryman, you know, write the most beautifully about writers. But I know my friends who are writers, we have these conversations like, you know, I was reading blah, 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 and I couldn't believe that this writer got away with this and did this thing that we never thought we could do, or so forth. So we have these kind of technical nuts and bolts conversations about writing.
Yeah. Let's go through the category. You mentioned them briefly, the way you break it down, starting with words. Just specific words, how important they are to note.
Well, I quote a friend of mine who talked about the editing process as putting every word on trial for its life. So when you're editing your own work, you stop and say, does this word need to be there? Can I think of a better word? Can I reduce 10 words to 1 word? Can I be more precise? Can I be more economical? And I think that's something that people don't realize enough, is how much writing really depends on those little choices, those seemingly little choices, just language choices. So one of the things I do in Reading Like a Writer is go through, in that way, great passages from literature that I love and say, look at this word, look at that word, look at this description. How is this writer using language in a way that we almost take for granted, but in fact somebody made those choices? You know, because I think when we're reading literature, there's a kind of assumption that it always existed. You know, always, a Chekhov story or an Alice Munro story was always the way it is, but actually someone sat down and wrote those stories, and someone made those decisions, and that's what we're reading sort of backwards to try and figure out how those decisions were made.
Can the decision about a single word really sort of be the crucial deal maker for a whole passage or chapter or something like that? Yes. Okay. Good. Sentences are next, and you have this very long, sort of ornate sentence by Virginia Woolf on an essay about illness that you say could be reduced to 8 words, but you still marvel at how it works, just the gymnastics involved in it.
Yes, I think it's, 181 words, isn't it? And it's this kind of model of clarity with semicolons. But the thing is, and it's great to do with students too, because you look at this insanely long sentence, and not for a second do you have trouble understanding what the sentence says. I mean, it's so clear. And students who are struggling with things like clauses and how they refer to, simple grammatical things, which 8th grade grammar really, which people either don't learn or forget, are all perfectly clear in that sentence. So it's very useful for students to say, I can only write or read a simple sentence, to look at this intensely complex sentence and see how clear it is.
And it's really a marvel of craftsmanship. All the things you study in the elements of style and things like that, she masters just unconsciously, and that's part of it, really, a good fundamental skill like that. The paragraphs are next in the book, and you quote
Isaac Babel,
Isaac Babel, the author, saying a set of dead rules as far as paragraphs is no good, and things that you read in Strunk and White and so forth are useful up to a point, but it's more of an individual thing. And in fact, paragraphing is examined as a way of identifying a writer. You can identify a writer by the way he paragraphs.
Right. I wrote the book partly like Tom Sawyer painting the fence. I mean, I would email my writer friends and talk to my writer friends and say, okay, can you think of a great paragraph or a great example of dialogue? And they would write me back. And in fact, one friend said, look at a Nero Wolfe book by Rex Stout, in which it's a book about forgery, really, or plagiarism, in which the identity of the writer is established by paragraphing. And I thought that's so perfect, to have that in a detective novel. And the Babel quote, which is such a beautiful quote, he talks at some point about being asthmatic and not having long enough breath to keep these long paragraphs. And so he breaks up sections into paragraphs to give a reader and himself, the writer, a kind of breathing space. So, and again, I can't remember if this is in the book. I think so. A friend was complaining about Garcia Marquez's Autumn of the Patriarch, which is all written in one paragraph. And he said, I like to drink beer when I read. And when I read Autumn of the Patriarch, there's no place to put down the book and pick up my beer because it's all one paragraph. Right. So there are all sorts of reasons why you might want a paragraph in different ways.
The fact that he and you mentioned breathing in there, which is why you would think, why would you need to breathe? You're sitting in a room. But you really advocate reading your work aloud, right?
For rhythm and cadence. I mean, one of the things I love about that Virginia Woolf sentence we were talking about is the rhythm of it. It's so beautiful. And many writers, myself included, would rather use, speaking of word choices, slightly the wrong word with the right rhythm than precisely the right word with the wrong rhythm, because the cadence of a sentence is so important, even to prose writers. I mean, we know that that's how poets work, but I think that prose writers often work that same way.
You're very big on beginnings and endings in the passages you put in there. There's a lot of them in there.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, I think, as someone with myself a bit of a short attention span, I think it really is true that you want, within a page or two, you do want the reader to give the reader reason to read on. You mentioned, how do you finish a book? Well, I'm someone who, by this point in my life, I don't finish a book if I'm not interested. I have no problem putting a book down. So you need to kind of get the reader interested. And it's not necessarily some sort of big dramatic hook. That, you know, I mean, I think I referred to, there's a Robert Stone novel where there's a dead body in the freezer in the first couple of pages. It doesn't have to be that, but it has to be something about the writer's perspective or the writer's voice or, again, language that makes the reader want to continue.
Other chapters in the book, narration, you examine character, what you can get from reading closely as far as character goes. Dialogue, it made a good point, and something that everyone who's been taught to write even a little bit is that you're not supposed to make dialogue sound like everyday speech, but you kind of take exception to that, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, one of the things, you're right, one of the things that young writers are taught is that everyday speech has all these pauses and hesitations, and dialogue on the page is much smoother. But in fact, as I say in the book, everyday speech is often more interesting than dialogue on the page because people say so much with what they don't say, with digressions, with things they add in, with little stories they tell. So one of the exercises I used to assign students when I taught writing was to just go and eavesdrop and write down the things that they heard. And you hear fantastic things eavesdropping.
Yeah. A good piece of advice, though, you said, is not to use dialogue for exposition. People fall into that mistake. And that's something you're also taught early on, but you're on the side of that one, right?
Well, yeah, actually it was great fun. You know, there's nothing that's quite so much fun as writing badly on purpose. I mean, accidentally it's less fun. But there's a passage in Reading Like a Writer in which I write an example of that kind of really bad expository dialogue, which is not real dialogue, which is just people giving information about themselves in the form of kind of fake dialogue.
Yeah. You talk about how Chekhov is very instructive to read and take apart and examine closely. In the end is a chapter called Reading for Courage. What does that mean?
Well, I think it takes so much courage to write. It really does. I mean, you know, not compared to many other things that people do. I mean, it takes, you know, less courage than going to war or being a window washer in a skyscraper. But it does take a certain amount of courage because your worst, harshest critic is often yourself. You know, you're thinking, this is terrible, no one will want to read this, what will my mother say? You know, there's a whole list of reasons not to write. And there are writers I think you can read, and I list a whole bunch of them, who were so brave in so many ways in what they took on and what they accomplished and their subject matter and their style, that when you look at these writers you think, okay, I can do this as hard as this is. If someone else did it this way, I can at least begin to try to do it.
Have you ever examined the work of a renowned writer more closely, read closely like you advocate in the book, and just said, wow, there's a lot less here than meets the eye? You don't mention that in the book, but I wondered if that's the way it went.
It's complicated because when I was doing the chapter on sentences, I thought, well, Faulkner, you know, who was a writer I always loved and still love, and I went and reread quite a bit of Faulkner, and I couldn't, what do I want to say? I couldn't extract a sentence to put in because they all were somehow so dependent on the other sentences that you couldn't really take a small passage. That Faulkner was, you had to get into the rhythm of the whole thing. But it doesn't mean I love Faulkner less, but it was just, he wasn't a writer I could use in that way. But you know, speaking of gesture, I mean, one of my favorite passages in the book is there's a gesture, an example of gesture from Raymond Chandler that he mentions, and that is when people were still wearing hats. You know, a man and his wife are in an elevator. The man's wearing a hat. A beautiful young woman gets into the elevator, and the guy takes off his hat. Right? That seemed to me the most perfect use of gesture to tell you something about the marriage, the guy, the woman, you know, whatever.
That's from The Big Sleep, and you got a list of authors and works that you must read immediately at the end of the book. It's very, very interesting and worth. That's worth the price of the book to me, and should be to most readers as well. The book is Reading Like a Writer. Francine Prose is our guest today, and this is Francine Prose is the author of 15 books of fiction, but we're talking about her 2 latest nonfiction books here, of which Reading Like a Writer is one. And we also want to spend a little bit of time talking about your most recent one, Anne Frank, the Book, the Life, and the Afterlife. And of course, the Diary of Anne Frank is one of the most well-known pieces of writing in the 20th century, and continues to be. Why did you want to examine this book, and what were the what was the approach to your research and writing on this?
Well,
this
I was
subject?
writing a novel. My last novel, Goldengrove, was written from the perspective of a 13-year-old girl. And following my own advice from reading like a writer, which is if you're going to write something, look at the best example of that that's ever been done. I thought, okay, what's the best book about a 13-year-old girl ever written? I thought Diary of Anne Frank, and written by a 13-year-old girl. So I began to read the diary, and I thought, this is really great. This is really a work of literature. And having written so many years after the first times that I read the diary, I was in a better position to understand how hard it is to do what she did. So my first intention was to write a kind of appreciation and a kind of close reading of the diary, and to say, look at how she does this, look at the kind of novelistic techniques she uses, the use of dialogue and exposition and scenes and so forth. And as I began doing research for the book, I learned some things which I hadn't known at first, and which I think few readers know. For example, most importantly, during the last months in hiding, she decided that she wanted to be a writer. She wanted to publish the book as a novel in a diary form.
How did you find this out?
It's, well, you know, it's not as if it's been out there.
It's
not as if this was some discovery of mine. It's just not widely known. And I think partly because of people's reluctance to take her seriously as a writer, to admit that a girl between the ages of 13 and 15 could be a literary genius. So, so she went back and revised the entire diary from the beginning, wrote sections that weren't there. So it isn't really even a diary as we normally think of a diary. It's a memoir written in diary form. I mean, she wrote everything. It was all by her. This has been authenticated, but it wasn't in every case written at the time of the sections that she dated. I mean, for example, the famous section in which she decides to call the diary Kitty, which is dated June or July 1942, was actually written in 1944. So she went back and wrote it as a writer would be writing it. So that was really a revelation. I mean, as I said, it's out there. There's in 1989, the Dutch Institute for War Documentation, which was actually answering the charges of Holocaust deniers, saying that the diary was a forgery, went through and published this huge volume in '86 in Dutch and in '89 in English, authenticating the diary, but also including her original draft, her revisions, and the draft that her father made after the war by combining the first two. But for some reason, no one has ever sat down and really compared her first draft. And
so you were able to put all the drafts side by side, look at the rewrites, all of it together. That was available to you.
And a way to sort of look at her process as a writer and her revision process. And you can actually learn a lot about revision from looking at the way Anne Frank did it, because the earlier versions are so, I mean, for example, when she began writing the diary, she was still in shock, really. They'd just gone into hiding, and she was a 13-year-old girl. By the end, she was a 15-year-old, and the difference between a 13-year-old and a 15-year-old is so huge that if anybody had, again, taken her seriously, they would have thought, how come the diary kind of sounds the same at the beginning as it does at the end?
That should have been a clue.
That should have been a clue. And in fact, if you look at the two versions, the first version is written in this kind of sweet, childish printing, little circles on the eyes, the way a kid writes. And by the end, she's just covering page after page with cursive. So really, she was a very different writer at the end.
Yeah. The book has always been sort of notable because it documents the transition from a child into an adult, almost like that. Is that enhanced by the work the research that you were able to do, or is it more like the adult going back and sort of reconfiguring the work of the child?
Well, she was writing about her own transformation from a child into an adult.
Okay.
So that's, and in fact, there's a beautiful quote from the poet John Berryman saying that that transformation from child into adult is something everyone goes through. How come no one has ever written about it so beautifully as she did?
The first part of the book, The Life, pretty much sets the stage, gives the background into her and her circumstances, of course, in World War II in Amsterdam, 41 through 44. And did anything super surprising as you put together all of that information to sort of provide the backdrop for her story emerge to you?
Well, all sorts of things. I mean, I looked at, for example, the circumstances surrounding her arrest. And you can go online and look at the photo of the policeman who arrested her. And that, you know, I spent also. This may be more widely known, but I didn't. There's a 10-second film of her. There's a film of her appearing at a window.
Where did that come from?
It was taken by. I mean, it was taken by accident. There was a wedding going on her apartment block. And some friend of the groom was taking a photo of the bride and groom coming down the stairs, and then by accident he just happened to pan up through the block, and there's a photo of Anne appearing, looking out a window, turning back into the house, looking out the window again, and you can see it online, and they show it at the.
And it's most definitely that warehouse, that build, that annex.
No, this was her apartment building before she went into hiding. This was when she was still out in the world, and it's startling to see it. As much as you know or think you know, to see her as an actual little girl at that window. You know, I watched it over and over and over and over, and somehow it was like, can this really be her? Can this really be true? Can this? And it is true. It was her, and it was quite extraordinary.
One of the things you uncovered in the section of the book called "The Life," the book we just talked about, and the remarkable things about her methods that you discovered there. The afterlife is interesting as well. I mean, the plays, the movie adaptations, all have a very complex and complicated story, don't they?
Well, the drama about the drama. I mean, once it's, you know, the process of turning the book into a play was, you know, there were lawsuits, there were accusations, there were all these interested parties. Something like 4 entire books have been written just about the writing of the play of the Diary of Anne Frank. So there was so much that went on. Lillian Hellman was involved, Carson McCullers, you know, a huge number of directors and producers. Maxwell Anderson was approached. I mean, it really was a huge theatrical story.
Yeah, very, very interesting book, and sort of unusual. A book about a book. This one's great. What is timeless about her diary, and why will it continue to live?
Well, it tells us about a particular historical period. I mean, one of the things, again, that struck me and why I wanted to write it was I thought, you know, in a few decades, people who lived, there will be no one alive who actually lived through that terrible period. And yet, among all those millions who were murdered, the name Anne Frank and the names of the people with whom she lived in the attic will be the names we remember. And isn't it extraordinary that because of a young girl, that will be the case, that those are the individuals who will stay with us? So that was really the other thing that kind of set me to writing it.
Francine Prose, thank you so much for all your wonderful works of fiction. Thanks for letting us sit down and talk about your nonfiction
Thank you,
books
it's been a pleasure.
Here. Yeah, Reading Like a Writer, and Anne Frank, the book, The Life and the Afterlife. And thank you for joining us on the same page.